turn the mics off.
Okay.
All right, folks. We're our microphones aren't. Oh, there we go. There's a microphone. Well, we're going to ask folks to start coming back to the table. We still have a lot of work to do. It's right around 2:20, and we have to get started with our and complete our prevention and training panel. But thanks, everybody. Is everybody set to go? Good, very good. So Steve Wickelgren, who's going to talk about who's going to talk about CIT Officers Association. So, Mr. Wickelgren, this floor is yours.
No, you don't.
I think somebody's working them. Turn on your mic. Here, tap to do that.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay. Thank you, Attorney General, Commissioner, rest of the working group. It's a pleasure to be here and provide hopefully some information and a little opinion here. I'm the clinical director for Minnesota CIT. Little background, I was a Minneapolis police officer, a sergeant, worked for about 27 years, retired 5 years ago. I am a licensed therapist at this point. I've got a private practice in the Twin Cities where I serve mostly public safety folks for depression, anxiety, PTSD, those types of things, as well as doing training throughout the state with CIT. So I want to give a certain perspective here by the end where I'm going to combine those two jobs that I do. For Minnesota CIT, we've been in business, a nonprofit, since about 2006. For Minneapolis PD, I've been involved with our CIT program since its inception in 2001. I took over and started supervising that in 2005, so I've got a bit of experience overseeing those programs. CIT is a concept that brings in all stakeholders who might be involved in the lives of people who suffer from some type of mental health crisis. And I would like to emphasize that word, crisis. I'm also in the mental health field, so when we start talking about CIT, again, it is a different animal when we start talking about a crisis situation. When we do our training, what we do is review the very common signs, symptoms, and behaviors of depression, anxiety, mania, psychosis, anxiety disorders, the very basics of that. The officers who have learned how the human brain works, they learn that and the basic forms so that they can incorporate some very general intervention techniques while they're dealing with folks in crisis. So part of our curriculum is literally looking at the brain. I mean, not the structure, but the function of the brain. And when we start talking about officers being trained, we have the same brain as everyone else in the community. There's illnesses, there are issues, but basically it functions in the exact same way. And that, again, will be relevant here in a while, I hope. Regarding CIT, it is seen as a best practices model by not just myself and others, but organizations such as NAMI, the National Alliance for the Mentally Ill, the American Association of Suicidology, the National Association of People of Color Against Suicide, Amnesty International, White House Conference on Mental Health, Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. All these organizations say CIT is the best practice model for law enforcement as far as de-escalation and working with people who are in a mental health crisis. CIT programs across the country have tracked their success regularly. In Minneapolis, we did it extremely informally. We didn't have the proper tools, at least at the time I was there. Agencies across the nation have shown that when they incorporate a CIT program, it reduces injuries, number one, to officers by approximately 50%, and then injuries to the community members or the person in crisis vary and drops from 40 to 60% reduction in injuries. So incorporating these programs has been proven to reduce the use of force, to reduce injuries on both ends of the spectrum. And yes, I am going to be biased here. I am in favor of officers being injured less as well as the public. There we are. When we do our trainings, it is quite often that officers at the end of the week-long training will come up to me and they're thanking me for the training. One of the big reasons is they say, this takes me back to why I went into law enforcement. And it was to help people. Because what it teaches them is to slow down, it looks at them as a person, and it makes that human-to-human connection to where this starts to feel good. And I refer back to what Chief Goldstein reported about, and I do believe this to be true, is that are we asking officers to do too much? My opinion is absolutely. And I'm not going to argue that we shouldn't do this, but when we are expected to learn a lot of information like autism, like schizophrenia, like PTSD, like personality disorders, which is extremely complicated, the amount of training it would take for every officer to be informed on every just mental health issue, much less medical issues and everything else. I'm not sure how much time would be left to be out on the street working. So there is, in many areas, a basic coverage of this information. So part of what we do is, again, teach about the brain, the function of the brain, our ability to think, to cognitively process what is going on. In order to do that, we use an example such as test anxiety. If anyone ever experienced that, the problem is we start becoming nervous about doing well on our test. We go into the room and we do not do very well because we're worried. This is a very basic human condition that I do not believe we can train out of police officers or anyone. So in dealing with the public, understanding how the brain works, that someone is frightened, that someone is angry, that they are confused, experiencing autistic symptoms and conditions. Okay, that is awesome to be able to understand that and then to specifically deal with that in the proper way. It would be awesome to be able to do that accurately. I love the slide on the signs of aggression and also the signs of an autistic condition. Which is it? It's one and or it's the other. The prevalence of violence with folks with autism, the prevalence of violence with folks with mental illness is pretty much the same. It is the same, whether you're mentally ill or not. We also teach that same kind of statistic. People with mental illnesses are 11 times more likely to be a victim of violence and crime. But they are no more violent than anyone else. The one thing we do share is that the entire field of psychology cannot predict when someone with mental illness will be violent. That is incredibly unpredictable. So when it comes to officer safety, they get this information. We try to push that out there, to slow down. That's one of the biggest pieces. Slow down, understand the human brain. I think it's really awesome that we sit here with full function of our frontal lobes, being able to talk and not get too emotional at times, although at times that occurs here. And we can think through this process. But again, I go back to that word crisis. Training is absolutely needed. police officers need to learn to train in crisis conditions. But here's one thing I know. I've talked to at least 100 officers that have been involved in a shooting in my practice and in my work. All that nice confidential, privileged communication, so I can't speak specifically about anything. But I will say this, that I have yet to talk to an officer who was involved in one of them and felt bad about how they behaved. And what that tells me is in that crisis situation, there's a brain that is not thinking very well. There's extremely strong feelings going on, usually fear, and then training kicks in. Let's flip the coin over. What are they dealing with? Most likely, someone else in crisis who is experiencing a very similar condition. Someone who's very emotional, who is in that fight or flight brain, not thinking very clearly. Who wins this battle? Do we come together and now expect reasonable decisions made with how many different options, as if it's a choice? I can't stress this enough. An officer in that position. Now, I'm saying, I've seen some of the stories, I've seen some of the videos myself, and I will judge an officer at times and go, that's not cool, that's not good. But I have yet to see one myself. Every officer I've talked to, I understand what they did and why, and it's unbelievable understanding how that brain works and what's functioning and what is not functioning. So I'm going to wrap it up here, but again, when we start looking at training options, we start looking at what to do about this, please keep in mind the human condition of this human brain, which under strong emotional conditions, we don't operate very well. Not like we can sitting here in front of it. Well, I'm not operating, I'm kind of nervous, so sometimes I'm not saying the right thing. But, you know, my point is, we can think through things later. In the moment, and unless you've been there, please, there's plenty of folks who have been through it, even right behind me. That strong emotional piece gets us to think, and maybe in ways we wouldn't normally do so.
So any questions for either one of our presenters for this panel?
So, it's not really a question, it's just, you know, more clarification coming into this. You know, I really wanted more information about like CIT and things of this nature. I really want to make that like a really strong recommendation, but you know, I need more information coming from you about like CIT.
Okay.
Like what does that mean? How is it, you know, implemented? I need more information from you so I can understand better what is CIT.
Okay, it's been around a while, and I apologize. I'm so used to it. It's a huge part of my life, and I'm assuming everyone knows, so I apologize. CIT is a 40-hour program developed in the late 80s out of Memphis, Tennessee. It was brought to Minnesota in 2001 after a similar mental health tragedy. In the 40-hour program, officers and now other folks are taught the basics of mental illness conditions, okay? They're not turned into clinicians, which is why a co-responder model is a great idea, to have a social worker or a mental health person with an officer. It's an awesome model, other than I have yet, and I don't know, Commissioner, if St. Paul's doing it yet. I know they've got one of the programs, but getting a civilian social worker into a hot 911 call, I don't think anyone's doing that yet. Okay. Do you know if St. Paul is?
I know there's several co-responder models, but as far as I
Yeah.
know, they're brought in after the,
Exactly.
after it's stabilized, so.
Yes, and so, again, that training to police officers is crucial, because the co-responders come in after, in a way, after the crisis is done. And maybe my definition of a crisis is different, because once everything's safe, yes, the person is still in a mental health crisis. and then the determination of hospitalization or wherever we go. So, again, that's the crisis piece I'm talking about. But they're also taught very specific de-escalation ideas. So if someone's very manic, I just use as an example, they're very ramped up, talking fast, thinking fast. Many programs, all they preach is active listening, which is a very good thing. But active listening will get you nowhere with someone that's manic. You can listen for 24 hours straight to someone who's very manic. So in order to accomplish something, we target a de-escalation technique to a mental health condition. And the overall model is slow down, observe the behaviors, take a guess at what is going on, try to implement that de-escalation and see if that does start to improve the situation. And it's not always a calmness, but as long as we're trying something, we're ahead of the game. It's when the officers back in the day, like we used to, rush in and take control before we answer or ask any questions or do anything. And that was the old school way, is I come in, I'm in charge, you will do and say what we're not doing that anymore. And yet, we still have these crises.
Follow up.
Okay, sorry. And actually, it's a question for both groups. Approximately, because I don't know if you have hard numbers on this, how many departments have their entire departments trained under CIT, and same under the CARE project that the Autism Society is running? About how many departments have actually moved into implementation, so?
First of all, my name is Ellie. I'm the executive director of the Autism Society. I'm sorry, I don't have a name tag. I don't have a succinct answer for that. What I will say is that since 2011, we have trained in the neighborhood of, in the order of magnitude of dozens of departments. I would argue that the nature of those trainings, if I trained a group once in 2011 and that has not been revisited since that time, it's the regularity and standardizing of that training that we see as the greater issue. But overall, we have not trained enough departments.
Okay, that's helpful. Steve, do you know?
Yeah, and as far as CIT goes, I'm not, again, certain. I'm going to take a guess and say, as far as entire departments, very, very few. Small percentage. Minneapolis is now, I believe St. Paul is fully trained. And I would guess, based on what I know, maybe 5 or 6 other agencies in the entire state. I can tell you that roughly 35% of the officers in the state are trained. And with such a large percentage of small agencies, that doesn't cut it. I was also going to share with you guys the recommendations that I would provide is influence with legislators, whoever, to continue funding through the post board of de-escalation training, cultural awareness training, bias training, and the mental illness training like was done a couple of years back. I'm already talking with agencies who say, yes, that's ending here in another year or so. Are we going back to what we had? What's the question? And yet there's a post mandate. And some of you know that financing issue as well as others. My recommendation is to continue with this. It's not going to go anywhere. The second idea I have is I talked about behavior. Officers' behavior, the public's behavior. That's the response between the two people that create these crises and these officer-involved shootings. Maybe I'm old and I'm thinking of the 60s and 70s, but I think it would be awesome to have some PSAs about encounters with law enforcement folks. What should it look like on both ends? I'll tell you this, officers seeing that on TV with good reactions from a cool, good-looking actor like myself might model behavior for officers to do better on the street, as well as better reactions from the public, so we don't get this strong emotional reaction where people quit thinking. A PSA would be one of my huge recommendations.
Ms. Nelson?
In response to the looking at how to train the whole state, I know one of the common pushbacks that we've heard has been a financial constraint. Last legislative session, the Autism Society of Minnesota had introduced a piece of legislation that was asking for funding to train the entire state in the care model of training. The amount we were asking for was $425,000. However, if every officer that received that training used that training to not require an emergency medical response to a hospital one time, it would have saved the state $26 million. This bill was not approved by the Senate.
Could you talk a little bit about how CIT is received on the autism community side of the fence? I mean, how do you guys experience it?
Oh my gosh, sorry. Thank you for asking a question, because this is what I was hoping you would allow me to volunteer to the group as I listened to Steve's testimony. I hope that you all, as part of your participation in this group, are able to sense and hold dear to you as you move through this process that we are not asking for things that are as mutually exclusive as they sound. We're talking about more training. Steve is talking about the fallacy that training can be the thing that's accessible to a person in a crisis. That doesn't mean we're not talking about the same types of solutions. And so when we talk about, for instance, the parts of CIT that resonate with us, I don't like that disability isn't included in the list alongside mental illness. That particular part, I feel as though we could evolve. I do really like the part about the training where we talk about the human experience of escalation and de-escalation, and that escalation happens not just in the civilians, but in the officers as well. The way that I would connect what sounds like disparate views on the matter between us and what Steve just said is that fear that he describes in the officer, and thank you for acknowledging that fear is real for officers while it's happening. Even in a crisis situation that could pose very specific dangers, I want to pose to you that the fear is too high relative to what we know about disabled people or people with mental illnesses based on what we know about them. I do think that training alongside the other integrated suggestions that we offer you will bring the fear down such that people can think more clearly. There are certain crises where there are clear dangers to people, weapons and other things that I have no experience in and can't tell you how to respond to. But I can tell you that people start in a place where they are far too afraid of people with disabilities and mental illnesses, and that is something that we can address through training, which makes us members of the same team, even when it sounds like we could be advocating for something that's different. Okay?
Because when you know and understand, we're not something to be afraid of. And is anyone in this room right now afraid of me? I'm a person with autism, but far too many calls are being responded to with stereotypes and stigmas that are causing officers to meet someone like me already in a heightened experience of fear. And that is what training can dispel.
I want to call your attention, that's also the testimony that the lovely family behind us gave before we came to sit up here. We believe in addressing the fear, and that will take multiple responses that are integrated. And there's lots of details to consider and resources to be spent carefully and judiciously, but we have to look at multiple models for that change.
So, Mr. Wicklegren, could you talk about recognition? I mean, if an officer approaches a person and they don't know, all they know is they got a call to show up here, what kind of training do they get to figure out whether they're dealing with somebody who's in an autistic meltdown or something else? How do they, what training do they get to recognize what they're dealing with?
That's exactly what CIT covers, and that's why I use the word behavior. The Vitals app, which is good, and I would absolutely promote it. We've had many success stories with that so far. The downside of that might be that your phone goes off and you see someone is nearby with autism. And then you have the negative connotation that there's going to be a problem. That would be part of the training, and that is
Right.
part of our training. Again, they learn that a diagnosis doesn't mean anything. I sit here with a diagnosis. I've been diagnosed with PTSD. And again, does that make me anything? Hell no, nothing. What makes me who I am is my behavior. And that's what the officers are trained to respond to, and also to differentiate the behavior between a severe autistic reaction and that acts of violence, that precipitory. And when they are close, I don't care who you are, it is extremely difficult. This is not an easy thing where people run around with the label of PTSD or autism. Clinicians, Dr. So-and-so is going to have a hard time. And now I go back to training officers on the huge variety of issues. We'll have Dr. Psychologists. You ask them about their expertise, they're going to have an area. And when I say, well, what do you know about this part? They go, oh, that's not me. I don't know about that. That's too much to be very broadly educated. Now, we can respond to training. Okay, don't get me wrong. We can respond to training, we do. We can do better. I just kind of cringe sometimes at the expectation of this perfection of knowing and having everything down and all of the expectations put on police. Good Lord, why do you think I'm with a huge caseload of PTSD folks? It's huge, and it's damaging them, and it is breaking some of them. And I don't know what the answer is. I really don't.
Yeah.
But we've got to do something.
Can I actually make one more comment to that before we take your question? I want to, again, encourage you not to uncouple what are the most
I agree.
dangerous, like the most dangerous circumstances with typical interactions with civilians in their community. What happens in the cases of the folks that we are here to represent is oftentimes things that start in a benign fashion escalate because of the cycle of trauma that's happening. So we can't just reserve our improvements for the strictly most dangerous circumstances, because sometimes we create those circumstances in typical interactions.
There's a video that's often used in some of the autism trainings that we do, and it's a young man in a park, and he's waving a piece of string in front of his face in a behavior that's commonly referred to in our community as stimming. A police officer, his mom is he had fairly high support needs, but his mom was across the street, like picking up something from like the dry cleaner or something. And a police officer approached him because his behavior looked unusual and said, "What are you doing?" He answered the question. He said, "I'm stimming." He ended up being tackled to the ground and restrained by a police officer because he was afraid of that behavior because he didn't have the knowledge. The young man did everything that was asked from him. "What are you doing?" "I'm stimming."
We probably have time for like one more question before we got to move to our next panel.
Chief Gottschalk, I think, next.
So, one of the questions I have is, one of the things I think needs to be said is that law enforcement disproportionately interacts with people that have
Yes.
chemical dependency, mental health, whether that's because of the community not understanding the behavior or because of the officer not understanding the behavior. I think the de-escalation is an important topic to touch on, because how that interaction goes is rooted in escalating and de-escalating behaviors. But so I mean, I would say a strong majority, I would say it's not unreasonable to say that when you look at the deadly force encounters, probably going to be a greater number of people that have either chemical dependency, mental health. We're confronted with a number of complexities. What level of training is the appropriate amount? Because obviously the police officers are called to, because of a social response and trying to, number one, control the situation and care for everyone's safety, but yet can't be an expert in immediately diagnosing. Look at a clinician, how long it takes to diagnose what they're looking at and how the best way to approach that is. Because your response to a person that's maybe high on drugs is different than a person that's suffering from schizophrenia, is different than a person suffering from autism. And I think that's one of the things, as you mentioned, what is the right amount of training? Because otherwise our officers can't sit in a classroom, 51 weeks a year. And I think that's what I'm trying to discern from all of the testimonies, what's the right amount of training, but also at what point can the officer hold the situation where it needs to be to have the right professionals address it, rather than trying to make the police officer be professional to the problem solving.
First or then?
Go ahead.
Okay. Chief, I am certainly not at all in contempt of the way you phrased what you just said. When we gave our testimony, we talked about the number of hours that we're talking about. Even CIT training, you said was 40 hours, a 40-hour program. That's not 51 weeks a year. There's a lot of space in between those two things. And I know, you don't have to apologize. I want to clarify for the group.
Was beyond your testimony.
Yes.
Because we have chemical dependence. There's a whole host of issues beyond yours, and I respect
Yeah,
everything that you guys
I
do.
understand.
And I value what you're providing, so I don't want you to take it to mean that is all. But I was pointing out what Steve had testified to as far as I want to be mindful of what our expectations of one person can be. And so I appreciate getting where we can get the greatest value from CIT and from what you're telling us.
My professional opinion, I used to be a use of force instructor, and those of you who have done this and understand the idea of muscle memory, repetition. I'm a trainer. The 40-hour CRT course is a training. What Post has mandated right now, the 16 hours, is information that's gathered, hopefully utilized. There is no real training component to that. It's awesome. All training is going to be useful, but when you sit down, but I'm going to say training, and 1/4 of the time of our 40-hour class, you're in a scenario or watching a scenario. It's repeated 4 out of the 5 days. People walk out, and we regularly hear they're utilizing it sometimes on their way home. So I believe to get an impact that is useful, I'm going to stand by the 40-hour course. We will continue to do a one-day class or whatever, because something's better than nothing. But I don't think you'll ever switch my mind from going to 40 hours where you can say, I've been trained. Otherwise, people will go, I'm informed.
And that wasn't my intention. I
Yes,
wasn't
I
hoping
hope.
to influence what you were saying. I just want you to understand we're trying to find how we get the best trained people, but also how we get them to a point where we can bring in the experts that can make an even greater difference than
Yes.
the police officers.
And
can.
your engagement in what you need from that training is exactly the kind of collaboration that makes that training more effective. We have no interest in training you to diagnose autism. That's not your job, and we wouldn't impose that responsibility upon you. What we want to accomplish is about being able to recognize certain factors that we know are predictors or in direct conflict with other training that you would have received. We want to know what is most likely to be practical in your day-to-day work. And, we want to focus on also looking at what different types of training can look like. I frankly think that training is not the same as learning. Training can be a part of learning. There is other learning that can happen with exposure to the community that isn't necessarily about learning about the facets of their diagnosis, but about getting to a place where you no longer assume what that profile looks like because you've had that experience. What if officers were a part of hanging around in places where people with disabilities are served? I don't know. This is part of what we're here to innovate.
And to that point, one of the questions, and I don't expect an answer now, but it's something I'd love you to think about and maybe respond to later, is there are a lot of different kinds of training that police officers go through. There's pre-service training where they're in college. There's academy training if you're in one of the big 4 or 5 departments. There's in-service training. There's field training. There's decision-making training. And what strikes me is, and I've been a trainer for most of my career too, is that, the gold standard for adult learning is active learning rather than passive learning. But the majority of the training I've had around mental health issues has been simply cognitive information, and it hasn't been integrated into, and what I really think we should at least think about is, how would you integrate this into best practices of training? So what kind of training and education would you have in the post-pre-service curriculum for all the kids that are going to come through the COP program, they're going to Mankato State? What education should they have, and how should that education be formatted? What should the training and skills look like? How much simulation time would you put them through in skills? How would you integrate CIT and autism training into, for example, the shoot, don't shoot scenarios that we use in the FATS machine? Do we have any occasions where when they walk into that booth to make that decision, they can look at this and go, I see, these are the triggers here, and I would do this now rather than do something else. I don't know that we're doing that at this point. So this is not a question, it's an observation that I think it's a place where we could start having a more substantive conversation about what training and learning looks like. And I appreciate the 40. I sent a bunch of people through the 40. I sent my entire department at Transit through the program there. But I don't know that that was enough. And
Right.
I get, trust me, I get how many days they get on the streets. But what's the cost of not having them trained to the level that you really want them trained to?
Can I respond to that? I think some of that is going to come from a cultural shift within the police departments themselves. There are a lot of forces that we are begging them to engage in this training, or they are engaging in this training at the bare minimum because something horrible happened and they need to save face. If the culture of the community, the police community can start to understand the importance of this, then we can start doing more. Like, we at the Autism Society, we don't have the resources to set up your scenario rooms and the shoot or don't shoot. Like, that's not something that's an option for us to develop. But when the departments are willing to come to the table with us and say, we want to do better, this is what we have found has been successful in the types of learning, how can we work together to make this? That's when we can improve that. Right now, we can only create what we can create on our own until the departments are willing to work cooperatively and come to the table with us.
We're very interested in that allyship. We are.
All
I've
right.
seen like the scenario room with the moving walls at the St. Paul Training Center. I want to train people in that. It's cool.
So we want to thank you all for excellent testimony. And it's time now to move on to our next panel, which would be panel C, Kevin Lutz. So, Mr. Lutz, Captain Lutz, please come forward. Thank you all very much.
Captain Lutz?
Sir, how you doing?
I'm well. Welcome. You, I think, got the record for the longest distance traveled today.
Yes,
Camden, New Jersey, is that correct?
right across the bridge from Philadelphia.
All right.
Correct.
So we like the Jersey people better than we like Philly people here, so.
We like,
so
we
you're-
like the
so-
Eagles.
So you're welcome, so, as long as you're not an Eagles fan, we'll probably be okay. So if you're ready to go, let us proceed.
Yes, sir. So I'm going to start with the story of Camden, our police department, kind of how we got to where we are today, where we were not all that long ago. I think it's very relevant to the conversation. The questions that several of you asked at the end, training has been something that I've been a part of for about 6 years now within our agency. We've been doing stuff that we believe is ahead of its time, and I think I'm going to answer a lot of your questions as I go through. If you have questions as I'm speaking, please ask. 30 minutes, 40 minutes, I could probably talk about the topics I'm going to talk about all day. I'm just going to bring up what I think is the most relevant, and if you have questions, please ask. So, when it comes to the city of Camden, it is 9 square miles. We're right across the bridge from Philadelphia, about 80,000 people, and not all that long ago, we had the distinction as the nation's most dangerous city. We've had as many as 67 murders in a year in that 8 square miles, and we've worked very hard in recent time to eliminate the crime that's going on. Our numbers have drastically decreased in recent years, and I'll tell you kind of how we got to that point. So our Camden City Police Department, we struggled with corruption, we struggled with accountability, and we were completely state funded for pretty much the entire function of the police department. All of our funding came from the state. After years of dysfunction, the department was abolished. That happened in 2013. We formed the Camden County Police Department that took over police services in the city of Camden, and about half of the officers that worked for the city, at our peak, we probably had 460. At the time of the transition, we had about 400, and when we transitioned over, we had 410 or so cops that transitioned to that county-run police department. That was under the leadership of Chief Thompson, who was the chief of the city department, then became chief of the county department. And we had a really unique opportunity at that point to shape the culture of the agency. We brought over half the people that bought into a new line of thinking, and then we were able to directly influence the people that we had coming into the agency in the way of thinking that we were looking to operate by. So that started at the police academy. We took over control of our county police academy. I heard how you guys do it here in Minnesota. It's a little bit different. We have 13 or 14 county-run academies where any municipal police officer can attend that academy in the state of New Jersey. So my first assignment as a newly promoted sergeant was being assigned at the academy and training the basic police recruits. So as I get into the 30 guiding principles on use of force and ICAT training and a couple of other programs that we're utilizing within the department, that shift in culture and that change in how we wanted our officers to police started at the academy, and I can't underscore that importance. It was poorly run leading up to that. The instructors were teaching outdated tactics. There was not much oversight as to what was being taught and how it was being taught. So we took over control of that academy, and we were directly influencing our youngest officers at their most impressionable time. So the department transitions in 13, and the chief takes a stance that we're going to change the culture of the agency, and we're going to do it through training. That started with the selection of the right people in the right places to get that done. Myself, a handful of other people who had been on the SWAT team, homicide, narcotics, had really experienced everything within the city, and we're going to garner the most respect from the cops, the rank and file, not only the recruits, but the rank and file. The chief made that commitment with 5 or 6 of us. It would have been very, we would have been valuable anywhere in the police department. He made that commitment to training, and we were able to deliver messages that otherwise might have been difficult for people to receive. They were hearing it from us, and they were buying into it. Another outside-the-box approach to this was the union, getting the union involved with this shift in culture. And I'm going to get into the specifics of the training program and the guiding principles, but getting the union's buy-in from the beginning, getting the ACLU and others involved in what we were doing, getting their feedback as we were unveiling these training programs, so that we were going to have not only buy-in within the department from the rank and file, but we would have that buy-in from the community as well. Top-down leadership, it has to come from the chief. He has to stand behind it, and there has to be a commitment to training. Training comes at a cost. We didn't do much training with the Camden City Police Department at all. I can count on one hand how many training classes I went to as a young cop. That has changed drastically, and I'll get into some of the specifics as far as what we're doing. Chief Thompson was the president of the Police Executive Research Forum at the time, so a lot of what PERF was doing, we were, in essence, the ones that were going to be like the first agency to carry out some of the things that they were doing. That started with the guiding principles on use of force, and there's 30. I'm going to touch on the ones that I think are the most relevant and the ones that we ultimately, at the end of my speech here, how we tied all this into our current use of force policy. Sanctity of human life, all right? That's the core, the baseline of everything we teach. We say that from day one. Everything that we do is guided by the sanctity of human life. We started a training program. I'm not going to get into great detail with it, but it's called the Ethical Protector Program. We're teaching our cops to be protectors, self and others. We talk about us going home safe. Every roll call ends with everybody goes home safe. It's our job to protect people. Often we have to protect people from themselves. That was probably the most important thing that we could hammer home right from the beginning. Protection of self and others, sanctity of human life, that's the first guiding principle on use of force. Adopting training policies that we're going to aspire beyond Graham versus Connor, right? We consider that to be the floor of training, the floor of what's acceptable. We were going to train to a higher standard. We were going to implement not only training but policies that supported that, right? We wanted to aspire to get the A. We considered Graham versus Connor to be a passing grade. We wanted to make sure that we were going beyond that in our training practices. That's a guiding principle I think is very important. Proportionality, proportionate response to what you're dealing with. Having the police academy to being the training at the academy consistent with what's being taught and what the agency values are. Rendering aid, that's in our policy, and I'm going to get to that in a few minutes, but we have a duty to render aid. When I first started and we responded to a gunshot victim or an aggravated assault victim, we waited for the ambulance to get there. Now it's a standing order. No matter what, we have a level 1 trauma facility in our city. Scoop and go, we get the injured person into the car, we get them to the trauma center. That's in policy, and that's part of that, that shift in culture. Again, that's called scoop and go. Adopting de-escalation formally into policy. We did that, and I'll go through that when I go through the policy, but an underlying thing that we were always taught is that we rapidly wanted to resolve every situation. You're responding to a person in crisis, you're responding to help somebody, and you wanted to get that done as quickly as possible. We teach our officers to use time as a tactic, right? Slow things down when it's feasible, when it's possible. Time is going to give you the ability to communicate, it's going to give you the ability to evaluate what you're dealing with, and more often than not, you can reach that desired outcome. Critical decision-making model. It is part of ICAT training, which stands for Integrating Communication, Assessment, and Tactics, another training program that I helped create with the Police Executive Research Forum. The critical decision-making model, and I'll go through each step, is just a formalized process that an officer can go through when they're dealing with any call for service. Not just a person in crisis. It's going to help you gather information and come to a desired outcome. As a police administrator now, I understand the importance of that. We're trying to shape desired outcomes. And when it comes to de-escalation, it's more than just training. You know, it's about a cultural shift in how we respond and how we handle things. We have created an early warning system that was first mandated by the Attorney General, but we went beyond that in that we put a significant amount of time and resources into real-time corrective action. You know, we witness something on the street, could be a minor infraction for tactics, it could be a demeanor issue, it could be something that's being actively investigated by internal affairs. But we're turning that training around within 24 hours where we're bringing the officer in. All our cops wear body-worn camera, so we're watching the videos with them, and it's all about corrective action, right? We don't want them to associate that training with discipline, although our training unit is working hand in hand with internal affairs. We're trying to address that situation so that it doesn't happen again, and we're doing that rather quickly. To answer a couple of the questions about simulator training, we've made the investment, and I don't know if anyone's heard of the Vertra 360 simulator. It is probably the most realistic simulator training that you can put officers through. It's about the size of this area right here. It's a complete wraparound screen, very interactive. We have that in our building. So it is rather expensive, but the back end of that is we're getting all of our officers trained in real time in situations that we can guide. If they're communicating well, if they're going well, you can control these simulations so that there's a desired outcome. If they're not, then there may be a force option. But one thing that I've learned over the years when it comes to training, you don't want them going into realistic training predisposed to this is de-escalation and I'm not going to use force. We're not saying that any of this is going to eliminate use of force, but we want appropriate force, and that comes with providing them with the training they need to be successful. De-escalation, communication, self-defense. Often, self-defense isn't taught beyond the police academy unless they take it upon themselves to train. If an officer can't defend themselves, they're going to be more likely to panic when they're facing pushback or they're facing some conflict. So very important. That's all things that we've interwoven into ICAT, into the 30 guiding principles, into basically everything that we do as an agency. Implementing a comprehensive agency training program for dealing with people with mental health issues and mental health problems. Talk about CIT, the 30 guiding principles, and ICAT is not meant to replace CIT. It's meant to work hand in hand with CIT. And at its core, we want to make sure that when the officers are responding, that they're not a medical health professional, but they're at least recognizing the behavior that's going to lend them to believe that that person is autistic, that they're off their medication, that they're high on narcotics, that they're intoxicated, whatever it may be. And a lot of our training is focused towards that, but again, it's not meant to replace CIT. The 21-foot rule. Antiquated. It is something that's kind of morphed beyond what I think it was initially intended to be. And we believe that it is very dangerous if someone has an edged weapon inside of 21 feet. No one's going to deny that. But this training will, in conjunction with other things, will teach the officers not to insert themselves into a scenario that otherwise didn't require their presence, and now that officer-created jeopardy forces an outcome that none of us want to see. There is credence to someone that is holding a knife inside of 21 feet, but what we teach the officers is not to rush in. If you were to respond into this room for someone who's suffering from a mental health issue and they're standing in the corner with a knife in their hand, why not go to the back, crack that door open and communicate? If he decides to come towards you, you simply shut the door. If we run up to that person, gun drawn, give them commands, they don't listen, they come towards you, that's officer-created jeopardy, and that's something that we're teaching them. It's okay to slow down. We don't want to insert ourselves into a situation that otherwise could have been peacefully resolved. And then our overzealousness or our response then forced what is in fact a legal action. We call it lawful but awful. So again, that comes back to Graham versus Connor. Drawing a line in the sand. There's a video in ICAT training that we show from San Diego with Mario Woods. I don't know if anyone has seen that video. Disturbing. And that kind of debunks that drawing the line in the sand where you're giving a command to somebody, they don't listen, they walk towards you, and then you exercise deadly force or whatever type of force when you simply could have moved your feet. Not going to get into the inner workings of that. I'll explain it a little further when I get into ICAT training. But we have a video that we think is very successful from our own agency where a knife-wielding person leaves the store. He's high on PCP. He's waving the knife around, and our cops let him walk down the street for about 10 to 15 minutes. Eventually, the knife slips out of his hand. They deploy a taser, peaceful outcome. 10 years ago, he's shot on sight when our cops respond. So those are tangible results to the training and the shift in culture. Scenario-based training, most important thing, PowerPoint has its purpose. When I get into ICAT training, there is about a day of classroom training, but a lot of that involves videos, feedback from the officers, and interaction. But most importantly, scenario-based training, either through simulation or actors, vitally important, because I can tell you that the officers that work for me are experiencing crisis on a daily basis. They're dealing with people high on drugs, off their medication. They're doing it every single day. If you don't experience that in real life, or you don't train in it, to expect a different outcome when you're faced with that is, it doesn't make sense to me. So you have to train, you have to experience it, and trust me, if our cops can do it in the city of Camden, it can be done anywhere, right? And I experienced both sides of it on how we used to police, and the way we used to police was the expectation. We didn't know any better. Now we do. Cameras have changed a lot of that. We're going to be held accountable for what we do. We're going to use those cameras to our advantage through training, and through sound policy and sound training, again, we can shape the outcomes that we're looking for. I talked about ICAT as far as, and again, ICAT stands for Integrating Communications, Assessment, and Tactics, not meant to replace CIT. It's meant to work hand in hand with it. When this was created, it was initially created to deal with the deadly force encounters where you're dealing with the person who's unarmed, with a knife, with a bat, with a blunt object. The concepts of ICAT would certainly apply to the response to a person with a gun, but once you're dealing with someone who's armed with a handgun in conflict, that really changes the response. It's a very difficult situation. There's cover and things of that nature kind of can't be utilized in the event that that firearm is discharged. So dealing with a person armed with a firearm that's aggressive in nature is a very difficult situation to deal with. Again, this training is relevant to the response to that call, which we get daily in Camden for a person armed with a gun where they're often not armed. This is meant to deal with those, roughly 1,000 a year police involved. We're looking at about 400 to 500 directly that we think ICAT can deal with. Challenges conventional thinking. Things such as we don't have all day. We don't use words like retreating. We use tactical repositioning. Okay? It's okay to move your feet. It's okay to back up. It's okay to get behind cover. We want our officers to stay in a winnable situation. We don't, again, officer-created jeopardy is something that we hammer home. We want them to stay in that winnable situation. We want them to put themselves in a position where time is being utilized as a tactic unless that threat is imminent. And often we have confused the two. We take noncompliance as an immediate threat, where often that could be drug-induced. It could be a lack of medication. So not automatically taking noncompliance with an imminent threat, right? Put yourself in a situation where you're behind cover, you're communicating, contact and cover where the additional officers that are responding to the scene, everybody has a role, and that there's, you're gathering all the information that you possibly can as you're responding. The critical decision-making model, it's like this. I'll talk through it. It's ever-changing. It's not a stair-step process where you're going to do this and then you're going to respond like this. It's ever-changing. At its core, ethics, values, proportionality, sanctity of life. At the top, you're going to collect information. Then you're going to assess the situation and the threats. You're going to consider your agency policy and procedure. You're going to identify options and determine the best course of action. You're going to take action, and then you're going to reassess the situation. We show a video during the training where an officer is involved in a shooting. He engages with a person on the side of the road. They're having casual conversation. He goes to pat him down. The individual pulls a knife out, comes towards him. He fires one round, hits him center mass, backs up, begins to give commands, and we look at that as a proportionate response to an imminent threat at that time. And when the officer was interviewed after that shooting-related incident, and the gentleman that he discharged his weapon towards, he survived. He said, "I knew I hit him. I knew he was going to be slower than me, and I knew I could back up and use time to help that unfold." Ultimately, a taser was deployed. The guy was taken into custody. He was taken in for treatment, and he survived that incident. But I think that's an example of a proportionate use and a proportionate application of force of a situation that didn't first start out as an imminent threat. It was a casual conversation that escalated, but the officer's actions were appropriate. Scenario-based training and self-defense, I covered that. Very, very important that some level of self-defense training is taught ongoing. I have applied martial arts my entire life. Was in the Marine Corps, wrestled for the Marine Corps wrestling team. It's something that I'm very passionate about and that I've translated down to the rank and file. I can tell you that the person that taught self-defense at the academy before I took over, it was exactly the opposite of what anyone in this room would want training the basic police recruits. He was the person with the tap-out shorts and the wraparound sunglasses, and it's exactly the opposite of what we would want our officers to be doing. So that program has to be in lockstep with policy, procedure. I tell the recruits from day one, there's certain things that I have to teach you, but I'm going to teach you how to put your hands on somebody if and when it's necessary, get them on the ground, and at a minimum, hold them there. The training time is limited at the academy. There's only so much that you can teach them. They have to be comfortable with that basic hands-on application, and we have a lot of tools now. Those tools are great. The taser is a great tool, but it has become almost the go-to tool for our officers in the field. Got to have a plan B. If that doesn't work, what's next? Are you getting it out just to show a spark display and try and gain voluntary compliance? What are you going to do if it fails? All things that we covered through training. Most importantly, those are the things that you're doing in your scenario-based training. Our use of force policy. The 30 guiding principles in ICAT, the policy encompasses all of that. I'm going to go through the 6 key principles of the policy, but we created this in conjunction with Barry Friedman, the NYU Policing Project, amongst others. We had input from a lot of different people, and I can tell you that the first version of this, when it came to us from NYU, after we had discussion, it wasn't practical. And I think what we came up with here is something that could be a model for anybody across the country. Our officers, when they read this, it's exactly what they've been doing for years, not a shock to anybody. But to other people that might not be operating the same way that we operate in the city, the people that haven't received the same training that our officers have gotten, some of this could seem like something that wouldn't be attainable or you wouldn't be able to utilize in the field. Core principle number 1, officers may use force only to accomplish specific law enforcement objectives. Core principle 2, whenever feasible, officers should attempt to de-escalate confrontations with the goal of resolving encounters without force. Officers may only use force that is objectively reasonable, necessary, and as a last resort. Core principle 3, officers must use only the amount of force that is proportionate to the circumstances. Core principle number 4, deadly force is only authorized as a last resort and only in strict accordance with this directive. Core principle number 5, officers must promptly provide and request medical aid. That, in and of itself, formalized into policy that we have had police-involved shootings where our officers were justified in their actions. We had a recent one. It was about 2 years ago now. I'm not going to get into detail, but I will say that the officer's actions saved the lives of many people at the time that he discharged his weapon. He immediately went into that protector mindset. He shot the individual. He neutralized the threat. There were multiple children and other people in this residence, and he holstered his weapon and began to render aid and got this individual to the hospital. So that is a huge shift in culture in how our officers would have typically responded in that type of situation not all that long ago. And core principle number 6, employees have a duty to stop and report uses of force that violate any applicable law of this directive. The duty to intervene, most Attorney General guidelines, I know ours encompass a few things that we said here, but a few of the other things are above and beyond that, and we think it's been very effective. I'm going to go through a couple of the core principles and just some of the verbiage that we incorporated. Core principle number 1, officers may use of force only to accomplish a specific law enforcement objective. Officers may not use or threaten to use force for the following reasons, and I find this one to be probably the most important: to resolve a situation more quickly. We want our officers slowing down and taking as much time as they need to resolve a situation without utilizing force. If that takes an entire day and that drains manpower from that specific area, they're taught to let that unfold for however long it takes. Again, time is a tactic. We are not to threaten or use force to prevent a person from resisting or fleeing in the future, or to force compliance with an officer's request. Again, that gets back to, we give a command, they don't listen. Often that translates to fear, panic, that you're going to associate that as an immediate threat. We train them to back up when feasible, get behind cover, continue that communication. Core principle number 2, whenever feasible, officers should attempt to de-escalate confrontations with the goal of resolving encounters without force. Officers may only use force that is objectively reasonable, necessary, and as a last resort. Officers will use de-escalation and force mitigation tactics and techniques whenever safe and feasible to do so. Officers will receive substantial training in the critical decision-making model, as well as when and how to appropriately use de-escalation and force mitigation, including but not limited to tactical communication, tactical positioning, and using time as a tactic. So that's formalized in the policy. Core principle 3, officers must use only the amount of force that is proportionate to the circumstances. Proportionality, it's a guiding principle. It's all throughout ICAT, a proportionate response to what you're dealing with. Consistent with training, some of the factors that officers should consider when determining how much force to use include, and I'm going to just, a couple of the highlighted ones, whether further de-escalation techniques are feasible, and the mental or physical disability, medical condition, and other physical or medical characteristics of the individual, and whether there are exigent emergency circumstances. As the situation changes, officers must reevaluate the circumstances to continue to respond proportionately. Over the course of an encounter, the circumstances and threats as an officer faces may change. Consistent with training and the critical decision-making process, while using force, officers must continually assess the effectiveness, proportionality, and necessity of their actions and their response. Does anybody have any questions about anything I've said so far, or do you want to wait till the end? I know I'm going through a lot of information. Yes, sir.
I'll admit that I like many of the things I hear you saying.
Yes, sir.
I really do. How are the officers accepting this training? I mean, I could kind of see how, if you tell somebody, hey, look, just because the person doesn't tell you to do what you told them to do, that doesn't mean you're going to walk up and get them in a headlock immediately. I've seen that happen. And I'm just wondering, how does it work when you tell them that's not how we're going to do things in the future? Is it working?
Again, we were in a very unique situation in our department where our officers, everything I'm talking about, nothing to them is going to be shocking or jarring or anything that they would disagree with. Maybe some, but the body-worn cameras have changed the game. Right?
Okay.
They have to, you're going to be held accountable for your actions, but we use the cameras in a way that we've gotten to a point where training is a positive encounter with them. They understand it. We have that simulator in our basement that they're coming in. If there's a use of force where they could have done something differently, within 24 hours, we're bringing them in, we're watching the body-worn camera footage with them, and we're putting them through a simulation that is similar to that, and they're watching it and they're saying, you know what, you're right. But they're hearing that from me. They're hearing it from Ralph Thornton, guys that have the credibility to deliver that message. Training wasn't always that way. The people in the Camden City Police Department who conducted our training, it was check the box, whatever the Attorney General mandated. We took a couple of written tests, and you did it because you had to. They're responding to it well.
That's great.
It's the reality of where we are today.
One more question, language. I mean, just to be perfectly candid, I've seen well more than one time where, you know, the officers really didn't touch anybody in a bad way, but it's like, hey, get the F off my corner.
Then
You
it's a-
know, and
it's a-
I'm just like, dude, you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to say that. And these young guys who got nothing but their pride to protect are not going to react well. You talking to them that way. And I just wonder, how do you deal with like even issues of language?
demeanor issues, they're coming in and we're going to watch the video and we're going to conduct that training the same that we would, once, if a criminal act was committed and it was an unlawful use of force, which we haven't had in some time. Again, it's messaging, it's how it's being delivered, and we're starting at the academy level, so nothing that they're hearing isn't what we've been delivering to them since day one. I didn't go through these numbers, but I'll read them off to you. Excessive force complaints since the formation of the police department. 2014, we had 65. 2015, 44. 2016, 31. 2017, 16. 2018, 3. And year-to-date, 1.
Wow,
In a very, very challenged city.
that's pretty good. No, I've been to Camden.
Camden's no joke. Yeah.
I've been to Camden. I know, yeah, Camden's.
They're doing it the right way. We're supporting them, and the reality is there's no other way to do it. It has to be done this way. And they're getting the work done. Crime stats have plummeted. I mean, we had crime stats that rivaled third world countries 10 years ago. Now we're at a fraction of that. So those numbers are all down while doing things the right way. So
Can you speak to the diversity of Camden, both in terms of the population you're policing and the department?
the population of the city is not more than 95% minority, black and Hispanic, a little bit of Asian American in one section of the city, and probably 1 to 2% white. The department itself is, I would say, I don't have the numbers directly in front of me, but I would more than 50% white. So that is a barrier that we have to deal with. We're a civil service department, and now we're drawing off a list to hire that is countywide. So it's not just city residents, where our previous department, everybody that came onto that police department was signing on to work in Camden City. Now we're a county police department that draws off a county list that is pulling people from all over. And we have the same issues with retention and hiring that many other people have, because many of the people coming in had no intention of working in Camden to begin with. They're getting the training, they're going to a suburban town, and they're making more money. I mean, that's the reality. But we have had a core group of a couple hundred that stayed the course, and we've accomplished a lot in a relatively short period of time. So, any other questions?
If I could follow up, particularly as we think about writing recommendations. When you're reviewing the tapes, what do you do to positively reward somebody who does it right?
So we have life-saving awards that we give out at our awards ceremonies. We call it track. So my current assignment now, I was recently promoted, is crime statistics, strategic deployment. We are showing videos. We're bringing the officers into our weekly command staff meeting, and it could just be a positive interaction with someone on a street corner, a woman on her porch. We're bringing them in. We're showing that video in front of the entire command staff as an example of what we're looking for and what we want them to do. So they understand it. I'm not going to sit here and say that what we require of the officers isn't difficult, but I can tell you that we give them the training that they need to be successful. We're not just, it's not lip service, us saying, you need to go out and do it this way. We're giving them everything that they need to be successful. That's at a cost. The machine that's in the basement is quite expensive. Pulling people off the street, it's expensive. Man hours matter, but making that training as impactful as possible, and again, trying to make the corrective action as positive as possible. And ways of doing that, documentation, things that we can do behind the scenes that the officer doesn't even need to be aware of, as long as they were receptive to the training session itself, is going to have them leaving there feeling positive, as opposed to getting a write-up handed to them that they're signing for after that remedial training session. If that makes sense. makes sense.
What's your body cam policy in terms of how, is it on
All-
continuously, or is it just on calls?
They have to activate any call for service, any potential interaction where police, where you're going to have to do something, it needs to go on. And then when we're going into a residence, if they ask you to shut it off, then we'll shut it off. And a lot of that policy, that's not my purview, or that wasn't
I'm
my,
just more curious, because the interaction with the lady on the front porch wouldn't get captured
Yeah.
in most of my departments, because it's, unless they got sent there on a call for service, it would get kicked on then. Otherwise, if it was just a straight-up interaction, she waves at you as you're walking by, it wouldn't get captured, so.
we almost have like an inverted patrol model. We don't have patrol anymore. We have a neighborhood response team, and about 80% of our officers are proactively policing in the areas that we predict crime to happen. So 80% of the patrol cops are in our most vulnerable areas engaging people. Those interactions, the drug dealers, and we have a way of capturing that has freed them up from paperwork where they're videoing everything. If it's not pertinent or it wasn't a compelled stop, then they're just capturing that on video. Then we have civilians that go back, watch all of those videos. We'll use facial recognition to identify people for intel and things like that. But our model is all about being in the areas that we believe crime's going to happen and having interactions positive with the woman on her step, as well as the drug dealers on the corner. We're going to capture all that.
Are your results replicable, or is this just sort of a good story from Camden?
I think it takes time.
Are there other jurisdictions?
There's
that
other
employed your techniques that have had similar outcomes?
I think our outcomes are tangible because of how bad things were, right? Like, we had a turnaround in 5 or 6 years that, I mean, it's almost unbelievable. There are other police departments where, I train people all over the state, I train ICAT all over the country, that are doing this, but they aren't interacting with the level of conflict that our guys are dealing with. So we have tangible results. I can show 30 videos in the last month where our guys are using de-escalation, could have used force and didn't. We're seeing that. I think other officers, other chiefs are coming on board with this, but they don't have the volume of calls for service or things like that, or they don't have the personnel to conduct the training at the level that we're doing it. So we're offering our services, we're allowing other people to use the machine. Other departments come in and use the simulator. And we're trying, another important aspect of this is that video that I talked about with the guy waving the knife. We have about 10 different agencies that operate in the city of Camden. We've worked with all of them to make sure that they're on the same playing field as we are, and they're responding to things the same way that we are. Because there were officers at that time, and this was 4 or 5 years ago, our officers had to hold back other agencies that wanted to run up and, interject themselves into that scenario, and I guarantee it would have gone a different way. So training with your surrounding towns and jurisdictions, very important.
I get a question.
Yeah, Kevin, I'm going to the topic of using the body cams for training purposes.
Mhm.
I'm guessing when you started implementing this policy and you started watching, I'm guessing you probably came across even some body camera footage of people violating policy.
Yes.
And did you have to cut people slack? Did you have a policy that, no, as long as we're using it for training, you're not going to be disciplined for what we see here? How did you handle that transition?
If they committed a violation, then they were going to be disciplined, but we've implemented a process that has made that much more palatable, right? If they had a demeanor complaint that came in, and then we watched the video and they used terse language and what they did was inappropriate, we're going to bring them in and their interaction with us is going to be positive. We're going to watch it. We're going to be like, listen, you should have done this, this, and this. Why did you do that? We're going to talk through it. And the documentation on the back end of that, as long as it's a minor violation, we're handling in a way that makes that interaction. They're like, you know what, you're right, that's not going to happen again, as opposed to bringing them in and, slapping the performance notice down and just disciplining them, if that makes sense.
So you had the support of their union too in doing this?
My union president teaches the critical decision-making model. So, yes, that is something that, he's a good friend of mine. I knew that he was on board when we were looking to implement change, but that has made any pushback, you get the union presidents teaching it. So, and our use of force policy, full backing of our ACLU, which you get the full backing of the ACLU and your union on something, you're probably going down the right path. So it's gone over pretty well.
Kevin Lutz, it seems like the simulator is a big part of your corrective action steps. You said it twice, it was expensive. How much was it and who paid for it?
We paid for it. We leased it. Again, I'm going to give a roundabout number. It's about $50,000 a year on a lease. And, you know, it's expensive.
Would you say it's money well spent?
Well spent. And we just got that, so we were utilizing, the U.S. Marshals had the simulator, and they were allowing us to travel an hour up, use it whenever we wanted. Wasn't very it was very time consuming. The chief, just as Chief Thompson was on his way out last month, this was something we had in the works, and the simulator just got implemented about a month ago, where we're now using that in like real time. We're out on the street. I was riding around the other night, watched something I didn't like, called the training sergeant, and we had the kid inside the simulator inside of an hour working through that same simulation with the desired outcome we were looking for. We would do that through actors and through other things previous to that.
Have you gotten any requests yet from other departments or other cities
Yes.
around you to?
Yes.
Okay.
It just went on the news the other day, so yeah, we've had quite a few inquiries.
Spark?
So when you're working with the officers, I'm sure there was some resistance at first, right? Because seems like a huge culture change from what I know of law enforcement in general. So during that time, did individuals or kind of personality types kind of bubble to the surface where it's like, well, it's just not going to work, and maybe they moved on to somewhere else?
Yes.
Or is this training model such that even the most resistant were able to be kind of brought along to buy into this whole new kind of way of thinking at it?
I would say that there's been people through the years who have not bought in, and they've left and gone to other agencies, which is fine by us. When it really, I'm sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought. What was the first part of your question?
Well, it's more that I'm wondering if this kind of approach that you're taking
Yeah.
can make even the most resistant buy in, and
Yes.
only the few outliers are the ones who are leaving.
That's accurate. I would say that we're touching the new officers, so all those now 3 to 5 year cops, they understand it. They understand technology, not resistant at all. I would say the most resistant are that 10-year veteran, the one that's been around a little while, did things a certain way. Those are probably your most resistant. And then your older officers, they love it. I mean, this is what they do. They don't want to get into physical altercations. They want to talk. They want to use their experience. So I would say the hardest people to affect are probably that 10 to 15-year vet. The older guys, everywhere I've gone, no problems whatsoever.
One last question. Could you use your method without body cameras? Or is it a critical component to what you're doing?
I think it's a critical component when it comes to accountability. And I think we've found a way to use them in a way that it's beneficial to everybody. I wouldn't have that video to watch, to train, to correct. You know, I can remember things in my mind that I did, but I'm sure if I had a body camera and I got to watch how things unfolded 15 years ago, there was probably plenty of training opportunities that I could have benefited from. Now we have the ability to see that. With that being said, the body cam doesn't capture everything, right? It's capturing a narrow view of an interaction. A lot of our city is under surveillance, under cameras of some sort that we have access to. Those are going to often paint a much different picture than just that simple body camera itself. So that's education of the public, so that, you know, people in the general public believe that that is going to capture absolutely everything, and that's not always the case. So education of the people in the city, at our community groups, things like that, we try and explain those types of things to them so that they understand. And we're very transparent with all our videos as they come out.
We're going to do two last questions, and we're going to try and make the pivot to the next topic. Your Honor, and then Elijah, you're the last question.
Just a couple quick questions. Your interactions, the training interactions with the public, it sounds like what that's based on are the principles of procedural justice, procedural fairness. Is that where you really got that information?
Yeah, so when we created ICAT, that was 2016. Chuck Wexler brought together about 65 people from across the country, and we looked at all best practices. So procedural justice, the CDM came from Scotland. I mean, we had outreach from people all across the world. There were a lot of lessons to be learned from Police Scotland on how they police, because they don't carry guns. So they don't deal with gun violence like we do, but they deal with intoxicated people. They deal with people with bats and knives on a daily basis, and they don't have a gun to go to. That's a topic, a whole nother thing I could speak about. But that's where that all had influence on this training and how it was created. All free, all available on their website with very specific scenario-based training, how to do it. We can do a lot of our stuff in the simulator now, but if you don't have that means, what the actors to do, triggers, how to walk through that scenario, it's all very easily digestible.
And your policy also uses the word necessary in uses of force. That's pretty unique in the country. I know California's recently adopted it, but you must have been one of the first police departments that adopted it, because we've used the Graham versus Connor standard, and this is in addition to that.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to train them to that higher standard, and we're going to hold them to it. That, again, not a big issue within our own police department, but I'm sure others that haven't gone through what we've gone through might view that otherwise. But I think it's on the right track.
And then your data on uses of force and fatal encounters, do you keep that information and do you share that with the public?
As far as police-involved shootings?
And any other uses of force? Any
Yes.
other data? What data do you share?
Yes,
You're
and
transparent in that way, right?
we're transparent with that, and we're also, the Attorney General in New Jersey put together a series of guidelines for early warning. So a lot of that information as far as triggering events for officers that are putting them into an early warning system, we're transparent with that as well.
And New Jersey's unique, right? The Attorney General actually is all the police departments report to the Attorney General.
He's the chief law enforcement officer in the state.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do not have the authority. But the Attorney General is appointed by the governor.
Yes.
And has a very critical law enforcement role. It is supervisory in nature, yeah.
He does, and he worked, the previous AG as well as the current, worked hand in hand with a lot of what we do with Chief Thompson. So, again, a lot of what we were doing was what was directly coming out of the AG's office as well.
And if you all want to give me that kind of authority, I'm.
I was going to ask you if you want that as a recommendation or not.
I'm going to get us off of that and over to Mr. Dara, so.
Thank you for coming out here.
Sure.
Actually, offline, I'm gonna have a little bit more conversation with you, as we continue to contemplate things
Sure.
here in Minnesota. I definitely want to commend the Camden Police Department. I've actually had an opportunity to view the particular video that you're referencing. I've viewed it dozens of times, and I've shown it dozens of times. And I would say that in this particular video, in many places in our state, that person would be dead. He would have been dead halfway through that altercation. There was even a couple of times where the individual kind of lazily, ushered the knife back and forth. But I was able to witness the use of force policy that you all implemented in action, and it was just remarkable. Everybody went home safe, including that individual. I had a question. Well, the judge asked one of my questions, but the other question that I had, and it kind of related to what Ms. Park asked, and that's about kind of like the union buy-in. I thought that I had read, and I might be mistaken, but I thought that I had read that all of the officers, even the ones that were currently on duty, had to agree in order to remain on the force, to adopt the use of force policy. Was that wrong, or?
If the chief of police puts out a use of force policy, they're going to abide by it. But,
Yeah, but I thought that I read that they were all.
everybody has to sign for the document, but when we rolled this out a few months ago, prior to, myself, deputy chief, and another captain went to every single roll call, went through it line by line, and made sure they were crystal clear. If there were any questions, we were there to clarify it. But to answer your question, they wouldn't really have an option
Yeah,
to
I
say,
didn't.
like,
I didn't mean the use of force. I meant the sanctity of life. That's what I was talking about.
Oh, that's part, that is, I put out documents on an ongoing, so on top of the training that they get, I'll send out refreshers and reminders about different things, expectations, things they've been taught, just throw out little nuggets for the sergeants to throw out into roll calls that they're signing for on their document management system, and it's just an ongoing reinforcement of their training. We're not going to just deliver ICAT training and never revisit it. We're going to deliver it, and we're going to refresh on it every year. And I didn't get to that part in the policy, but we're going to, we formalized that we're going to deliver this training every single year to the cops. Now, we're holding ourselves to that standard to make sure that we deliver it to them, and it just becomes an everyday part of what they do. It's not all right, we went to simulator training, and that's the only training you get for the rest of your career, which is often what many departments do. We're going to have that commitment to training ongoing forever. So, and we put it in policy. So.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful. I think many of us have more questions. I've seen the ICAT training and done a bunch of the training and have brought some of that stuff to some of my departments. So had not heard about your simulator though, and I've got simulator envy right now. But all it requires is, damn, Ingebrigtsen left.
I mean,
was hoping
when you
he'd be
think
here for
about
the
that
bonding bill conversation
but
about
that number-
giving me a bonding bill for that money. Oh, well.
That number, think about that, 50,000 a year, right? If that eliminates one
Yeah, no, that's,
terrible use of force that would have cost the city $1 million, then it paid for itself 10 times over. So
right.
I think that was the thought process behind it.
all right. Thank you very much, so, all right. We've asked Superintendent Evans to do some opening comments, and in the last presentation, he really didn't have a chance to answer any questions, so we brought him back primarily so that folks could ask questions. So he's going to do some opening comments and then be available for questions. The next half an hour or thereabouts is kind of what we've got scheduled, so. Go for it.
Co-chairs and members of the committee, thank you for having me back again. My name is Drew Evans, the superintendent at the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and I would just echo, I think we mentioned this in the last presentation about the ICAT and the belief we have as the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension in that process and what they've done. We've actually had them here doing train the trainer trainings across the state of Minnesota with PERF and several of the trainers here. It really is a program, to your question, is it replicable? I absolutely believe it is, or we wouldn't have brought the training here to Minnesota, and we believe it really can have an impact if, as he said, agencies really take the principles to heart and really create a culture within their organization of doing them day in, day out in what that does. So we do have the commissioner doesn't know this, we have a simulator at the BCA, not at that level, but he'll be jealous of theirs more as we go forward with that from there. I do want to highlight just a couple things that maybe I didn't get a chance to in the last, or to reiterate as we go through, and how challenging some of these investigations really can be, and some of the things that we've been doing as an agency really to address and hear some of the concerns that have been expressed both today, throughout this, and through the work that we've been doing. Some of the things we've been doing to examine our own internal processes, the Association of State Criminal Investigative Agencies, which is the association of all the BCAs of the United States. 49 of the 50 states have a state police agency primarily responsible for criminal investigations. We have a use of force investigation committee. For the past 4 or 5 years, that group has been working diligently on these issues. As those agencies have determined, we conduct approximately 80 to 85% of all officer-involved shooting investigations in the United States from those member agencies. So we've been working with, the COPS office when some of that work was being done, IACP, others along the way, thinking through some of these challenging issues. The IACP, I sit on the Police Investigative Operations Committee as well, which is a committee of the IACP that looks at some of these issues and has been working on them as well. The BCA this summer spent time traveling across a number of our counterparts in the United States to really understand from a boots on the ground perspective, how are they conducting these criminal investigations, both as the investigative piece and how the prosecutors integrate into that process really from the beginning, learn from them to ensure we're following both best practices for the state of Minnesota and look for areas of potential improvement. One of those that is an idea that I don't know how else to bring it up, so I will here, that I learned about in Georgia that this group may want to think about. And again, this would really be up to prosecutors and other pieces in the process as well beyond just the investigation, is Georgia's implemented a 2-tier grand jury process. They have a process now in there where they have a grand jury that they consider a civil grand jury that has a public transcript, but it's impaneled simply to look at whether or not a use of force was justified or unjustified. And they were calling it a grand jury, but I think of it much more of like an inquest or an inquiry into the initial phases. And then if that grand jury were to find that that was an unjustified, it goes back to the prosecutor who has the traditional tools that they would have in any investigation, whether that be a criminal grand jury, charge out by charges at that time, or take a different path at that time. In the state of Georgia, that transcript is then public. From that, the jurors are still protected, is my understanding, and more work would need to be examined for this. But they feel that that process has been a different way of looking at this to ensure some level of transparency while still having the public involved in these decisions in terms of the actual investigation. So I just bring it up as an interesting approach that I saw as we did that work across the country. We do it also as well this morning, and one of the items was talked about releasing information, and we will release and we continue to release all information on these investigations once it's closed. I think maybe I may have misspoke or the information didn't get out quite correct. We are regularly now feeding pieces of our investigation to prosecutors as the case is going. That's being done to help review or speed the review process by the prosecutor, and also to create greater integration with the prosecutor's office, so that as the investigation is occurring, if they have follow-up that they'd like to see to make sure that that's occurring, we don't wait till that entire case file is presented for review. So we try to create some more efficiencies in that. What we're referring to is that the case file and any public data at the conclusion of investigation will be put out to the public. Our perspective at the BCA when it comes to video of an officer-involved shooting continues to be that the public absolutely has a right to see that video. Our perspective is, our goal is to protect the integrity of the investigation, and that video should be released from us as the investigative agency once that case file is closed. And what that means that the case is concluded, reviewed by a prosecutor, and then the outcome has been adjudicated through the legal process at that point in time. We don't have a position on local agencies releasing video if they believe they should, under the confines of the Minnesota Data Practices Act, which provides very specific instances in which that data can be released. I do want to say to the victims' family members here that we are working on a number of things to try to help. I've heard loud and clear from families when they are saying that they don't feel that they feel supported in that process, that there's services available to them, that the information is not free-flowing throughout the investigation. And we currently have at our human resources right now, we'll be hiring a community and family services position within the BCA to really help guide that process. So we'll be working more directly with families from the very beginning of these situations through the legal process to ensure they have information, access to services, that we can make sure that we're helping guide families along the way to make sure that their needs are heard, understood, and met as we go through that process. So we're in the process of filling that now. We've also started to move forward with, and we'll do this with families' permissions, is that once a case file is closed, to more readily locate that information, it'll be posted on the BCA website, a link to the file, so the public and others can access that information. I continue to hear the calls for transparency, and everything we do in the law enforcement investigation piece is documented, as public information when it's closed, and we will make that information available in even a more readily, easily accessible way, which we're moving forward on right now. One of the ideas that you heard today as well from Mr. Damone is talking about an NTSB review process. for this panel's consideration, there are processes like that in place already in Minnesota. Infant Child Mortality Review Board at the state level and many local levels do, what I'd consider a social autopsy of what actually occurred in situations where a child died while they had involvement in our child social services in Minnesota. Certainly that's something you could look at to really examine, are there areas for improvement as a profession that we could have an examination after one of these incidents occurs, or are there other things that we can look at generally across the board with those as well. The other piece that I do want, and I'm happy to report because it's been talked about a little bit here, not specifically, is the FBI use of force reporting. I got an update this week. Minnesota is actually one of the highest reporting states in the country. The BCA collects all use of force information on behalf of the FBI, which they have a new FBI use of force reporting tool for incidents resulting in substantial bodily harm or death. We've decided to collect that centrally in Minnesota at the BCA to make it easier for law enforcement to report that information. And we have over 70% participation rate in the state right now, which is really good. We want to push that up and above really to 100% across the state so that we can really understand as a profession, as a society, when our police are using force that results in substantially bodily harm and death. And then we can compare that to the rest of the United States. Once 80% of the law enforcement in the United States is reporting. It's a requirement of the FBI. So it's part of why we want to see everybody reporting into that system. With that, as we've kind of noted before, I'm happy to talk about anything else. We have certainly created a much tighter integration with our prosecutors, as I think the county attorneys alluded to in the last presentation. We're working with them really from the very get-go in these investigations to ensure that we're meeting their needs so that they can have a case that is really as complete as possible. We'll always have some follow-up in any criminal investigation, often occurs, but to make sure that we're doing that so we get through these cases in an expeditious but thorough and complete way so they can make those decisions that they need to make across the board. And with that, I think those were just kind of the comments I wanted to wrap up with a few other things. Oh, the last thing I did want to talk about is part of going through this. The investigators that we have, I did a quick survey of our investigators at the BCA. On average, the BCA investigators have 20 years of experience. And you talked a lot about education. We believe in education at the BCA. Over 30% of our agents have master's degrees in this profession. And we're really looking for those people that are going to come in with critical thinking skills to look at all cases in a really objective fashion. And that's something we have been working with them on to training, talking about on a regular basis to ensure we're really keeping that wide open mind as we're conducting our criminal investigations across the board, not just officer-involved shootings.
This may be a little duplicative, but indulge me. Look, it was in the press quite a lot after the Newer case that there were some issues. And I guess I want to just ask you, what have you learned? What changes have you made so that we can say with a clear conscience and a straight face to the public that there's no way the BCA is cooking an investigation just to advantage a person they might deem as a brother officer?
And the first, my absolute expectation of all the agents that work at the BCA is that they don't cook the books for anybody, regardless of who they are. If that's a police officer, a public official, whoever it is, they take an oath and a duty to uphold the law and to objectively investigate any case that's given to them, and that's our expectation of them. From that case, I think we've learned a lot in terms of ensuring that we have that tight integration with the prosecutor from the very get-go in these investigations. I still think that we're talking through some of those pieces along the way from there. There are some things that came up in that case that I certainly have a different perspective on in terms of what exactly occurred in those, in terms of some of the pieces that were there. But that being said, I think that our organization is a learning organization that continues to grow, that our agents do an excellent job. They're highly professional. They take, anytime they are criticized or accused of covering for a police officer, that's been done often, that they really take that to heart. And they take it to heart in the instance that they believe very strongly in doing the right thing. And if they are somebody that's not doing the right thing, they don't have a place in our organization, period. Because that's the expectation that we have as an organization for them. And day in, day out, they really show that that's what they want to do. I do think there's some other things along the way that we've done with that. We've had implemented a fairly robust audit process when those cases are presented to the prosecutor, so that we're reviewing everything that's been done to make sure that all the Ts are crossed and all the Is are dotted. I think it would be a misnomer to say that any organization that I would come forward to you and say it's perfect and doesn't have room to improve every day. We've done things like and gone much more in depth in terms of the investigation that we've done in the past. That doesn't mean those cases weren't investigated, but we want to make sure that every rock that needs to be overturned is overturned in these investigations, and really so that the prosecutor can be assured that we've looked at everything they need to make that sound decision in those cases.
Let me just follow up, early on, one of the first sessions we had was on officer wellness. I believe in officer wellness because I think anybody who's serving the public needs to be fully ready to do that, and we need to be mindful in doing that. But it did spark some questions from some folks who came forward, like, well, what about us? I don't know if this is a fair question to ask you, but see what you can do with it. When a family has a loved one that they have lost in an officer-involved case, are they eligible to get services from crime victim reparations? Are they not? That might not be in your ballpark, but I do think that it raises the question for me. What about them? What kind of help can they get?
They would be eligible if they were charged, if the officer was charged.
Okay.
Typically, there is in the state statute on crime victims reparations, it says that you're not eligible if you were committing a crime at the time that the injury took place. So typically, when the Crime Victims Reparations Board, which reports through me, through the Office of Justice Programs, they look at the case to see if there was a crime committed, and then they try and parse that to some extent. So but in an officer-involved shooting, typically, it would depend on whether there was a chargeable offense that they would have been subject to.
So in any case, even if the officer is charged, it probably isn't until that happens. So for a while, they're just on their own.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
There's probably some emergency supports from the county that sometimes comes in. Part of what we've asked to do with getting this family liaison is to try and help us help that family sort of negotiate or sort of walk their way through this, because we hear from a lot of the families that they have, what do you do about the funeral? How do you plan the funeral when the body may or may not be released until after the coroner has made that decision and made those determinations? What can you do and what you can't do? So what we're hoping is having this family liaison will give someone that can help them walk through this process. We recognize that, whether it's a mom or or a relative or just the nearest next of kin, they're all in the middle of the trauma too. So, one question I do have, which is, and it's one of the challenges that I discovered when I got here, with 87 different county attorneys, is there a guideline for what the county attorneys want to see from the BCA or from anybody that's doing these investigations? Or is there a blueprint that we should be following that would be universal across all 87 counties?
Members, no, there is not. It has a discussion I've had with the County Attorneys Association Board. I think with 87 different people, the diversity of thought makes that challenging, but it's something we would absolutely welcome at the BCA because clearly, just for pragmatic reasons, we can't do things 87 different ways. We need to really be operating from a standardized protocol. That doesn't mean we won't meet specific needs of different prosecutors across the state. We're used to doing that, but a standardized protocol would be very beneficial to us.
Peters?
This is a question around resources. Obviously, these investigations, we want to make sure are done accurately, timely, not rushed. Obviously, the BCA has also seen an increase over the last year, 2 years. At what point do you say we can't investigate this one, we don't have the resources, and now what controls do you have in place if you're going to work with another sheriff's department? The reason why I asked too is just the recent Richfield and Edina case. The Hennepin County Sheriff's Office was asked to take that. Was that because the BCA couldn't, or was that a city decision?
That was still a city decision there. There's some cities in Hennepin County that still utilize the sheriff's office for those investigations, which is normal in that situation. I do think it's, in terms of resources, it's certainly becoming taxing. And what I will tell you, you've heard a lot of talk about body cams and video. That's really what's taxing us in many respects. In Hennepin County, for example, Mr. Freeman's office, they may have 300 videos in one case that we need to watch real time. And so the BCA still has a very large investigations division, if you think of it from that perspective. But I was just visiting an office in Marshall this week, and my Marshall narcotics agent was watching body cam video from a St. Paul case and writing reports as to what he observed. So it's really been something that has taxed us in many respects, and that in particular, besides the actual volume, is what's driving a lot of that.
Just a quick follow-up question then. Is there consistency among agencies on how these are investigated?
I can't speak for the other sheriff's offices. I know we're in contact with them, and we have, and we'll certainly, provide them any background we may have on this. But we've been in contact with really the two other sheriff's offices that may do some of these investigations.
Thank you. Superintendent Evans, a couple of questions about your investigations. So uses of force investigations and certainly fatal uses of force are incredibly complex investigations. They require a lot of resources and training. The statute's complex as well. One of the things, based on my experience, almost 2 decades of investigating these types of cases, the Department of Justice has a specialized unit in the Civil Rights Division that actually handles those investigations. A specialized FBI agents who work hand in hand. And I really like your comment about having the investigators work hand in hand with the prosecutors. That's certainly the model that I used, and I know that division uses today. Do you have a specialized unit of agents who handle specifically uses of force incidents?
So my agents that handle these are homicide investigators that are stationed across the state. They are the ones that conduct these investigations, so they have specialized training and experience, obviously, in doing death and homicide investigations. They also all spend a 3-month intensive training program with a medical examiner's office in Ramsey County, where they learn about death investigation, wound interpretation, violent death investigation, et cetera, with them as well, in addition to the work and the training and on-the-job training that we provide within the BCA.
But that's homicide. That's not actually uses of force, which is a different type of crime, unlike robbery or car theft. Is there any thought about having your officers train with the FBI, maybe at the FBI Academy, on specific uses of force, because that requires a specialized type of training and investigative techniques?
We haven't had a discussion. I'll tell you, we've worked with the FBI closely on these cases. I don't think that from the process that we've followed that there'd be anything overly unique as to what we're processing in terms of these actual investigations. Certainly, we've worked with them carefully from there. We do recognize, and I'm glad you pointed out, because it's often said that this is just another homicide investigation, and it isn't. It's an officer-involved shooting investigation, and that is what we're doing when it comes to those cases. And so those agents are the same agents that are conducting those cases across the state. So it's our homicide section that does them, but they are conducting these. It's only a certain set of agents that's leading these investigations.
And just to follow up to that, do you take any effort to ensure that those agents that are assigned to a use of force investigation don't have any relationship with the particular jurisdiction you're working in? Because if you're using homicide agents in a particular community,
Yep.
they may know some of those officers, and of course that would create an issue of whether it's actually an independent, transparent investigation.
So we do in the sense that if they have a personal relationship with the individuals, I don't want to say with the agency, for example, it's going to be hard to not have anybody
Sure.
doing work with, say, a Minneapolis Police Department, but we do tell, we work through that. If somebody has a personal relationship, those agents will not be involved in that investigation. There are times, depending on if it's a person that, for example, that has a relationship with a number of them, we may send a team in from a different area of the state that wouldn't have that relationship.
Do you think there'd be any value to having sort of a team of specialized agents who could actually respond to a use of force incident where they have that specialized training to take control of the scene and to have that expertise where they can actually conduct that investigation throughout the state?
So we've had that discussion internally. It's certainly something we're open to, having a discussion about, and something that could work, and that it would be a group of people. Now, in Minnesota, as we said, there's only about 20 of them a year, so figuring out the staffing and what that would look like is something that would need to be discussed. But as we've said, and if I haven't been clear enough here, the BCA is certainly very open-minded when it comes to officer-involved shooting investigations, process improvements, different ways to look at these in terms of that. There was a time period where the BCA had a conflict of interest actual unit. It wasn't focusing on use of force investigations at the time, but they were doing all the corruption and peace officers accused that they were outside. So we've done that in the past with that. It's certainly an area that we could explore as well, as to whether or not they would specialize in just use of force investigations.
Thanks.
Mr. Chair, I think going back to Commissioner Harrington, your question about a standard protocol of the 87 county attorneys, and I want to make sure people understand, and even Drew's response here, county attorneys, we do not investigate, and it would be unethical for us to direct an investigation. And what we do is we rely upon the investigative protocol of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension. And, speaking for St. Louis County, at least for 40 years, we've had an extreme high level of confidence in how they do it, and we know their protocol. If there's something different we would like to see in the investigation, then we contact the agent who's been assigned to the case. Hey, could you follow up on this, or what do you know? Sure, absolutely, I'll check that out, or we'll see. So I don't want anybody to think that the county, into the 87 county attorneys would have a protocol on how these cases should be investigated. We might have internal, or we could have a standard protocol about what we do with them when we get them, but not how they're investigated. We have high expectations that they're going to be done the best possible way that we can right now. Does that help make it
And
clear?
I appreciate that. Maybe I misspoke, but in my conversation with some of the metro area county attorneys, they had an expectation of being involved from the earliest possible instance. And then when I've talked to other county attorneys, they said, no, we don't want to talk to you until the case is completely done, and then you wrap it up and you send it to us in total. And so for us, for the BCA, then it's like, so how do I know which one you are? So are you a group that doesn't want to be involved in having a lead investigator or a lead prosecutor who's working with the BCA throughout the investigation? Or, so it would be helpful to get a better sense of what the county attorneys really do want. And then what are the pros and cons of the different approaches? Because we know there are different county attorneys. I've had that happen in the last month. I've had one who said, absolutely, no, we'll just wait till when the file gets to us. That's when we'll start talking about it. And like, okay, well, we'll do it your way, so.
Sure. And in response to that, there is not a consistent policy. Like, we're probably one of the counties where we do have a person designated, that's the contact person from the beginning. And I like that. I can't say if my 86 other brothers and sisters, would all agree. What are we talking about?
You and 2 or 3 others, I can tell you, are on that page.
Yeah.
I'm still trying to work through what the other 84 or so would like to see, so.
And just thank you for your comments, just as a follow-up to that, and thank you for clarifying that, because I would agree. And I've been with some of the other, Maricopa County, for example, it's really talking about a broad framework so that we're all on the same page for what that process will look like, as opposed to dictating, the minutia of the investigation. Thank you.
Mr. Darris?
I got a series of questions, actually. So the BCA is typically called in to investigate after an officer-involved shooting. For what reason, would you say?
It's at the request of the local agency, so they're the ones making the determination, and they're contacting us to investigate the incident, to thoroughly investigate, so the prosecutor can make a decision as to whether or not that use of force was justified.
So that the department is investigating an incident involving one of its officers, right?
That's correct, yeah.
And so I heard the judge ask you who conducts the investigations, and you said back to him that it was the homicide unit?
At the BCA.
At the BCA.
Yep.
So in that particular region, the BCA agents that handle homicides are the ones that would then begin investigations with this incident too,
Yep,
right?
that's right.
So if this was just a homicide that happened in, somewhere, would those officers, would those detectives in that local department investigate just a regular homicide that occurred somewhere in the city, not an officer-involved shooting, but just a homicide? They would be working with the investigators and the department to solve that homicide, right?
Yeah, they would be in those situations. So I think that's alluding to the question is that, they would, but if they have a relationship, on the officer-involved shooting side, then you create walls and, in that situation so that they're not investigating people they're working with on a regular basis.
No, I get that. I get that. I'm actually, going in a direction because I want to try to echo some of the sentiment that the community feels with regards to, whether or not that still rises to the level of a conflict. And so if the homicide unit within BCA is the same homicide unit that investigates homicides, and it also investigates other critical and serious incidents with that same local police department, those same local detectives, clearly that would still rise to a level of some type of conflict that would make the community have a little less trust. And so when I hear the judge ask, is it possible, would it make more sense to have like a specialized unit that aren't interlaced with the local police department, that could rapidly respond, even if it's via helicopter, could rapidly respond, to an incident that would lessen, would you agree that that would lessen incidents? Because they're going to have to continue to work with those detectives and with those officers in homicides and other serious incidents, even after that officer-involved shooting investigation, correct?
Yeah, so, I agree with all of this, and this is one of those things that would be, probably part of your deliberations and discussions you'll have is what that looks like. So there's more than one way to do that. You can have a specialized unit that's smaller, that the homicide agents are still doing this day in, day out. I'll also say, that when we say the FBI has individuals doing this, they do, but they're the same agents we're working with every day. I know the ones that we've worked with that are involved in this, they don't just work these cases, they're doing so. And these same homicide agents are also
Civil rights cases.
in civil rights cases.
Right.
Yep.
But they're specialized civil rights agents, designated civil rights units.
Yes, so they are, but the local agents are still the ones we're working with every day, that are doing child abuse cases, other cases that we're regularly working with them from there. So when we look at this, I agree with the concept that I think it would help eliminate some of that close connection if you had a unit that's all they did, and then you'd have to look at a staffing. I will say these same homicide agents are the ones that are doing conflict investigations, regularly arresting police officers and public officials across the state year in, year out, and they do have a high level of integrity. But I also, when you're talking about the perceptions and concerns of the community, that's exactly why I think we should have this conversation to determine, is there a better path?
Yeah, and then I guess the final course of questions that I will have is just in terms of how BCA is interfacing and interacting with family members during the course of the investigation, especially on the front end of the investigation, as I'm sure you've heard a lot of the angst that's come from various different family members and other community members, just in terms of those relations. It concerns me that the BCA is only recently getting ready to hire this family liaison when it appears as though, there has been, a pretty large outcrying of we're not, filling the connection points, we're not being contacted, our calls aren't being answered. Because again, I want to continue to talk about how community is viewing BCA investigations and how BCA, at least from a communal perspective, is interfacing back with community.
So it's an excellent question. We have regular ongoing contact with families in all of our investigations, and we do that. Part of the reason we're hiring this position, as we hear, is that it's one way to look at it from a concern perspective. We look at it as, is there a better path forward? that regular contact was occurring. It's with police officers that are investigating cases day in, day out, moving on to others. And we're looking at it from a perspective, is there a way to do better with somebody that specializes in this type of work, working with families that are experiencing trauma and the challenges that come along with this to help coordinate those services and do better than we can. Because I've heard the same thing you have, and I hear that angst and I hear that anxiety, and that's exactly what we're trying to do to set a path forward that will be better for everyone.
Can I follow up on Lily's question? With the addition of this liaison, have you considered, because you mentioned earlier on, looking at the sort of the NTSB review model, or in some departments use Sentinel review, of involving community in that review process as well?
Yeah, I throw it out for an idea. It's certainly something that the BCA, as we've said, and I think it's important, that wouldn't be a process led by us by any means. It would be a group of professionals, community members, others outside, because as we've said, our job is to investigate at the BCA. It's the prosecutor's job to make a determination as to whether or not that force was justified. So I think that would be something for all of you to think about and consider if that process makes sense.
Any other questions? Thank you very much. Thanks. All right.
Are there any affected families who've come in this afternoon? We want to thank the affected families who have come again, but we do have a 15-minute slot for any families who have joined us recently. So if there aren't any, and now it's time for to start our open forum conversation.
And we also have a couple of announcements about the next meeting.
You want to make those now?
Yeah. No? Okay. Never mind. We're good.
Okay, then we'll open it up for open forum. And having had the experience of the first session, we asked folks to keep their comments to 2 minutes. In the absence of anyone that wants to come forward at this time, I want to thank everybody for coming today. I want to thank you for the testimonials that we heard today. I know some of them were wrenching for you because the wounds that you're suffering from are still very open. I appreciate all of the technical expertise that was brought to today, and I can promise you that more information from the ICAD and CIT and others will be being sent out to the working group and will be posted on our website, so that the information that we have will be available to the public as we continue our deliberations.
Let me just say in closing, thank you to my co-chair, Commissioner Harrington. Just remind everybody that this is a Minnesota process. There are some people on the working committee, but it is not only our views that are going to prevail in this process. In fact, it is the testimony we get through that table that is so critical, and through the website. So we want to encourage people to continue to participate. And again, thank you to everybody who came to testify. This is a process which I believe, and I believe I can speak for John as well, we hope that we'll have a safer Minnesota for everyone when we're successful. And by the way, once we come up with our recommendations, that's sort of just the end of the beginning. If we're going to make them policy, we're going to need everybody all over again. So there's some thinking that's going to have to go into how we persuade our legislators and other folks to make sure that these great ideas actually become real. So with that, oh, I see a hand. Yeah.
So the lesion that the guys from the BCA was talking about, what is the criteria, what is it, like what would be the role? Maybe they don't have that answer yet, but I would like to know what would be the criteria, or what would be the role that they would be doing in that role. Because the families really, really need support, and I heard Chief Harrison say
Ms. Galloway, I will get the job description for the family liaison posted onto our site. I do not know the quals for it off the top of my head, but I know we have looked at our Office of Justice program, which has crime victims staff that works with crime victims, and we've also looked at some of the work that the counties do in terms of victim witness relations staff there to try and create this position. And so we'll have that posted though, so you can see what it is, and we hope that we will get some great applicants who will be able to help us make that linkage between the investigation and supporting the families that have lost their loved ones.
And all of us want to thank you as well. So, any announcements we're gonna make? Okay, well, with that, we'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
It's always in order.
All right, here we go.
I believe a motion to adjourn is always in order. That's right. I kept trying to go sign die, but that was always in order.
Probably that too. They probably.